Today we will explore one of the greatest enigmas of medieval metallurgy, the existence of a lost metallic alloy that, according to historical and archaeological evidence, gave the shields of Middle-Age warriors truly extraordinary resistance. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There was something different about those shields. It was not immediately visible to anyone observing them for the first time in museums or archaeological storage facilities scattered across Europe. It was necessary to look closely, with precise instruments, with the trained eye of someone who devoted years to studying the materials that shaped the medieval world. But when the difference was finally noticed, it became impossible to ignore. Certain medieval shields, discovered at archaeological sites throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, exhibited characteristics that defied what was known about the metallurgy of the time. They were more resistant than they should have been. Their chemical composition revealed traces of elements that were not part of known production techniques. And most intriguing of all, no available historical document explained how they were made. The first time this pattern drew attention in a systematic way was during the work of European researchers who, in the post-war period, began cataloguing and analyzing more rigorously the collections of medieval artifacts stored in museums across the continent. Many of these objects had been collected during excavations in the late 19th century, when medieval archaeology was still taking its first steps as a rigorous discipline. At that time, it was enough to identify an object as a medieval shield and place it on a shelf. With the development of metallurgical analysis techniques throughout the 20th century, especially with the widespread use of mass spectrometers and electron microscopy techniques, this picture began to change. Researchers could now examine a fragment of medieval metal and obtain detailed information about its elemental composition and internal microstructure. And when these techniques were applied to the museum collections, they began to reveal surprises that no one had foreseen. To understand the magnitude of this mystery, one must go back in time, not to modern laboratories where scientists examine medieval fragments under electron microscopes, but to the noisy, smoky forges of European Middle Ages. One must imagine the world as it was between the 11th and 14th centuries, when war was a daily reality for kings, nobles, knights, and peasants. When survival in combat often depended on the quality of the equipment brought to the battlefield, and when the knowledge of blacksmiths was literally a matter of life or death for those who relied on their products. In medieval Europe, the blacksmith was not merely an artisan. He was a central figure in the social and economic structure of any community. Entire towns depended on the skill of their master craftsmen to produce agricultural tools, household utensils, and, crucially, the military equipment that determined the fate of kingdoms. Medieval forges were the most advanced technological centers of their time, where raw iron extracted from the earth was transformed into objects of precision, strength, and sometimes unexpected beauty. The shield was one of the most important pieces of equipment for a medieval warrior. Across different eras and regions, it took on varied forms. The round shield of the Vikings, the teardrop-shaped Norman shield, characteristic of depictions of the Battle of Hastings in 1066, the heraldic shield of medieval nobility, the shield of infantry formations. But in all these variations, the fundamental function was the same: to interpose between the warrior and enemy attacks a barrier capable of absorbing or deflecting impacts from various weapons, from arrows and spears to sword or axe blows. Thus, the construction of an effective shield was an exercise in applied engineering, even if the artisans who built it did not use that term. The shield needed to be strong enough to withstand powerful impacts without shattering, yet light enough not to exhaust the warrior carrying it. It needed an adequate shape to deflect strikes efficiently, and it needed to be durable enough to survive multiple battles, as replacing a damaged shield in the middle of a military campaign was often impossible. These conflicting requirements were met by medieval artisans through a combination of materials: a wooden base, a covering of treated leather, and metallic elements on rims, bosses, and reinforcements. It was precisely in these metallic elements that researchers had identified the unusual compositions. It was the metals that preserved in their chemical composition, unalterable over the centuries, a silent testimony of how they had been produced. The metallurgical process of the Middle Ages was at once rudimentary in its instruments and sophisticated in its accumulated empirical knowledge. Medieval blacksmiths had no access to the chemical equations describing the transformation of iron into steel. They did not know the scientific principles governing the crystallization of metals, the influence of carbon on hardness and flexibility, or the role of alloying elements in determining the mechanical properties of a material. But they knew through experience handed down from generation to generation the concrete results of these transformations. They knew that certain types of ore, subjected to specific temperatures and treatments, produced a metal distinct from the rest. They knew that certain mixtures, certain processes, certain secrets passed from master to apprentice in carefully controlled practical demonstrations yielded materials that far surpassed the common standard available on the market. And that was precisely what made the problem of the medieval shields so fascinating to researchers, because the shields exhibiting those unusual characteristics were not products of imagination or popular legend. They were real, tangible objects that could be examined, weighed, and chemically analyzed in a laboratory. And what the analyses revealed was unsettling in its clarity. These shields contained a metallic composition that did not correspond to any documented technique of European medieval metallurgy known to historians of science. To understand what this meant, it is necessary to understand a little of the basic chemistry of metals. Pure iron is a relatively soft and malleable metal. When heated and worked under specific conditions, it absorbs carbon from the fuel used in the forge, typically charcoal or coal, transforming into steel, a considerably harder and stronger material. The amount of carbon present in steel determines its properties. Low-carbon steels are more flexible but less hard, while high-carbon steels are harder but tend to be more brittle. Finding the right balance was the central art of the medieval blacksmith. But carbon was not the only element that mattered. So-called alloying elements such as chromium, manganese, nickel, molybdenum, and vanadium can be incorporated into steel to alter its properties in sophisticated ways. Chromium imparts corrosion resistance, manganese increases hardness and improves hardenability during quenching. Nickel adds toughness and impact resistance. Molybdenum increases resistance to heat and deformation. Vanadium refines the granular structure of steel, making it more uniform and resilient. These are well-established principles of modern metallurgy, known and systematically applied since the 19th century. What researchers were finding in the medieval shields, however, was a combination of some of these elements in proportions that, according to all available knowledge, should not exist in artifacts from the European medieval period. The question was therefore deeper than it seemed at first glance. How could medieval blacksmiths, without access to scientific chemistry, without precise measuring instruments, have deliberately produced a metallic alloy that incorporated elements whose specific properties were unknown until centuries later? There were two possibilities. Either the process was accidental, the result of particular production conditions that no one knew how to reproduce in a controlled manner, or there was knowledge, transmitted orally and practically over generations, that had been lost over time. The first suggested that medieval metallurgical excellence was largely a matter of fortunate circumstance. The second, far more unsettling, suggested that at some point in the Middle Ages, a body of technical knowledge regarding metallurgy had existed and then vanished completely, leaving no clear written records, bequeathing none of its secrets to subsequent generations. To understand which of the two hypotheses was more plausible, researchers needed to look beyond the shields. They needed to examine the broader historical context of medieval metallurgy, searching for evidence in manuscripts, technical treatises, royal armory inventories, guild records, and any other document that could shed light on the metallurgical practices of the era. What they found was both enlightening and perplexing. European Middle Ages was a period of enormous metallurgical diversity and technical exchange far more intense than is usually acknowledged. There were active trade routes connecting Western Europe to the Middle East, Central Asia, and India. And along these routes traveled not only spices and textiles, but also ideas, techniques, and crucially, materials of diverse natures and origins. Metals coming from distant lands reached European forges, carrying with them chemical compositions that local blacksmiths could not replicate using only the mineral resources available in their region. Medieval trade was a vector of technology transfer more effective than is generally recognized. When a Venetian merchant brought a shipment of metal processed in the Middle East from Constantinople, he was transporting a specific chemical composition that reflected ore sources used thousands of miles away. And when this metal reached the hands of a skilled European blacksmith, the result could be something qualitatively different from what the smith could produce with strictly local materials. One of the best-known and most studied examples of this metallurgical exchange is Damascus steel, which represents one of the greatest enigmas in the history of metallurgy and serves as a fundamental point of reference for understanding what happened to the alloy of the medieval shields. Produced mainly in the Middle East between the 3rd and 18th centuries of the Common Era, Damascus steel was famous for a combination of seemingly contradictory properties. It was simultaneously extraordinarily hard and remarkably flexible. Its blades exhibited characteristic patterns of ripples and swirls that were visible expressions of its complex internal microstructure, and its ability to maintain a sharp edge was legendary among warriors who encountered it on the battlefields of the Middle East and, later, during the Crusades on the borders between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Damascus steel was produced from wood steel, originating in India and Sri Lanka, with a unique composition containing nano-structured carbides and, according to research from the 2000s, possibly carbon nanotubes formed during the production process. The technique was lost around the 18th century, likely as a result of the disruption of trade routes bringing woots from India and the extinction of the master craftsmen who possessed knowledge of the process. For centuries, scientists attempted to rediscover its secrets, until European researchers published studies identifying nanoscale structures in original Damascus steel, demonstrating that nanotechnology had existed, accidentally yet functionally, centuries before its formal discovery by modern science. The story of Damascus steel is relevant to the investigation of medieval shields for a fundamental reason. It demonstrates concretely that sophisticated metallurgical techniques can exist, be used successfully for centuries, and then be lost entirely, without leaving enough records for their immediate reconstruction. If this happened with Damascus steel, a technique widely known and traded on a large scale, what could not have happened to other metallurgical processes, possibly more localized and more secretly guarded? Researchers examining the medieval shields had to consider this possibility with utmost seriousness, and in doing so, they also needed to examine another fundamental element of European medieval metallurgy that had previously been underestimated in its sophistication: the blacksmith guild system. Medieval guilds were far more than simple associations of workers. They were complex, highly structured institutions that controlled access to specialized technical knowledge, regulated the quality of products offered to the market, established strict apprenticeships hierarchies, and protected their members' trade secrets with a rigor that a modern company would immediately recognize as intellectual property protection. A guild's most valuable secrets were not written down in manuals or accessible treatises. They were transmitted orally, demonstrated practically, guarded with a jealousy that sometimes bordered on obsession. When a master died without having properly passed on his deepest knowledge, the secret died with him. When a guild was dissolved due to war or political persecution, the techniques it held could disappear from history without leaving a recoverable trace. It was therefore entirely plausible that the metallic alloy found in the unusual shields was the product of a specific blacksmithing tradition, belonging to a particular guild or craft lineage which had developed a sophisticated process over generations and deliberately kept it secret. But there was a problem with this explanation. If the alloy were the product of a single production center, one would expect the shields containing it to come from a specific geographical region or a well-defined time period. What researchers found, however, was a baffling geographical distribution. The shields with unusual composition had been found in different parts of Europe, in contexts suggesting distinct origins and varied production periods spanning several centuries. This made the hypothesis of a single guild responsible for the technique harder to maintain and opened up space for more complex and, in a sense, even more intriguing explanations. The investigation, which had already revealed surprising layers of historical and technical complexity, was about to gain a new dimension, and as so often happens in the history of science, the decisive breakthrough would come from an unexpected direction. Not from metallurgical laboratories, but from historical archives, where documents that no one had examined with sufficient attention for generations patiently awaited researchers with the right questions. In the early 21st century, a researcher working on cataloguing medieval manuscripts in a European library discovered something that had gone unnoticed by generations of scholars. Hidden among the pages of a 12th century treatise on alchemy was a set of technical notes describing, in deliberately obscure and ciphered terms, a metal refining process. The notes used the coded language typical of medieval alchemical writings, where authors deliberately obscured the meaning, blending symbolic metaphors and esoteric terminology to prevent knowledge from falling into hands they deemed improperly prepared to use it responsibly. Deciphering the notes took years of collaborative work. It involved experts in medieval Latin, historians of alchemy, philologists specializing in medieval technical texts, and metallurgists capable of assessing whether the described process made sense from the perspective of chemistry and material physics. The result of this collaboration was a discovery that shed completely new light on the mystery of the medieval shields. Once deciphered, the text described a production process involving the deliberate mixing of different types of iron ore, selected based on their specific geographical origin. The anonymous author of the notes described how different ores, coming from distinct regions, possessed what he called different virtues, an alchemical term that, in the technical context of the notes, corresponded to what modern chemistry would call a differentiated elemental composition. And the specific combination of these virtues in proportions determined by accumulated experience produced, according to the text, a metal of superior qualities that rendered the objects crafted from it stronger and more durable than the standard product available on the market. The interpretation of this text in light of modern metallurgical knowledge revealed something of immense historical importance. The medieval author had discovered, through purely empirical means, that combining ores from different regions, which naturally contained different alloying elements in their geological composition, produced a steel with superior properties. Without knowing what chromium, manganese or vanadium were, the medieval blacksmith had understood that mixing certain types of ore produced a better material, and he had developed through trial and error across generations a process to identify the most effective combinations and reproduce them with sufficient consistency to guarantee the quality of the final product. In addition to describing the raw materials and their geographical origins, the text contained references to specific heat treatment processes, how the metal should be heated, the ideal temperature described in qualitative terms of color and behavior of the glowing metal, and the precise sequence of each step. These processes, known today as quenching and tempering, are fundamental in determining the final properties of steel. In terms of modern metallurgy, the combination described in the manuscript would correspond to the production of medium to high carbon steel, enriched with alloying elements from the selected ores and subjected to a quenching cycle carefully controlled through the artisan's visual observation. It was a discovery of significant proportions for the history of science and technology. It demonstrated that medieval metallurgical knowledge was far more sophisticated than generally assumed, that among medieval artisans there was a genuine capacity for systematic empirical observation that allowed them to achieve results that formal science would only explain centuries later, and that the loss of this knowledge had represented a real and measurable setback in human technological capability, a setback that took centuries to be recognized as such. The discovery of the manuscript also raised new questions. If the process had been documented, albeit in cipher, why was it so completely lost? Was the author already recording a tradition on the verge of extinction? And how had this knowledge reached him? Had it been developed independently in Western Europe, or had it arrived via the trade routes connecting the continent to the Islamic world and the East? To answer these questions, researchers needed to expand the scope of their investigation, and in doing so, they found evidence of a story far broader than they had imagined. What made the metallic alloy of the medieval shield special was not therefore the general principle of combining different materials to achieve superior properties. It was the precise specificity of the combination. It was the fact that someone, at some point in the Middle Ages, had discovered a particular formula for mixing ores and treatments that produced a material with exceptional strength and combat performance characteristics, and they had kept this discovery strictly secret, likely as a competitive advantage in an armaments market that was extremely lucrative and highly competitive. The trade in military equipment during the Middle Ages was a business of immense economic and strategic value. Individual knights invested fortunes in their gear, and kingdoms spent considerable sums on their armories. A blacksmith who produced noticeably stronger shields could charge significantly higher prices and secure exclusive contracts with royal houses or powerful nobles. The secret was, quite literally, money. And in the context of the Middle Ages, it was also power, prestige, and personal and family protection. It was these practical considerations that explained the extreme secrecy with which medieval metallurgical secrets were kept. Accessible records posed an unacceptable risk. Any document describing the process clearly enough could fall into the hands of rivals, and medieval master blacksmiths understood that risk all too well. Behind the lost metallic alloy were real people. There were master blacksmiths who had dedicated their lives to perfecting their craft. There were apprentices who spent years at their master's sides, absorbing knowledge that was simultaneously technical and almost sacred in its importance to the community relying on it. There were families whose livelihood and identity depended on preserving a secret handed down from generation to generation. And there was, at some point, a rupture, a moment when the line of transmission broke, when knowledge was left without a proper heir to perpetuate it. What had caused this rupture? Researchers identified several factors that likely acted in combination over time. The Great Plagues of the Middle Ages were certainly one of them. The Black Death of the 14th century, which swept across Europe between 1347 and 1351, decimated between a third and a half of the continent's population. Entire communities disappeared. Master blacksmiths failed to fully pass on their knowledge to apprentices who died before being ready to receive it. Entire guilds were dismantled by the simultaneous loss of their most experienced members. Wars had an equally devastating impact. Artisan communities were destroyed when cities were captured by enemy forces. Stockpiles of ores from specific geographical origins, necessary for the process, were destroyed or lost in the conflict. And the trade networks supplying these materials were often the first victims of hostilities, blocking routes and severing relations of trust that took years to rebuild. There was also a third factor: gradual technological change. Throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, traditional shields became progressively less important as central elements in an individual warrior's protection. The growing sophistication of plate armor reduced the reliance on the shield as a primary barrier. And with the introduction of firearms at the end of the Middle Ages, the entire paradigm of individual weaponry was irreversibly transformed. Without demand, the incentive to maintain and pass down the knowledge needed to produce these exceptional objects simply vanished. The question modern researchers were asking themselves toward the end of their investigation was inevitable. Would it be possible to rediscover the lost metallic alloy? Detailed chemical analysis of the medieval shields had provided precise information about the alloy's composition. It was now known with reasonable accuracy which elements were present and in what approximate proportions. The challenge was no longer identifying what was in the alloy, a task modern analytical techniques had solved efficiently, but understanding how it had been produced with the resources and techniques available in the Middle Ages. The alchemical manuscript had proven to be a valuable, if incomplete, guide. Its instructions, once deciphered with interdisciplinary rigor, provided concrete clues regarding the geographical origin of the ores used, the main stages of the production process, and the qualitative signs the medieval blacksmith used to assess product quality at each stage. This information was fragmented by centuries of imperfect preservation and deliberate obscurity in the language used by the author. But it was enough to guide preliminary experiments in modern laboratories. Groups of researchers in European laboratories began attempting to reconstruct the process, using ores of identified medieval origin and following the deciphered instructions as closely as possible. The initial results were promising, revealing that the correct combination of raw materials and thermal processes was capable of producing materials with compositions approaching those found in medieval shields. There were variations suggesting that nuances of artisanal knowledge still resisted reconstruction, for the distance between reproducing a chemical composition in a laboratory and reproducing a process developed over generations was, after all, considerable. The medieval blacksmiths who had developed the metallic alloy were not scientists in the modern sense of the word. They worked with fire, hammers, glowing metal, and inherited knowledge that they tested and refined over a lifetime of dedicated practice. Their science was a science of doing, living in the hands and perception of practitioners, disappearing when those practitioners ceased to exist without proper heirs. But what they had discovered was absolutely real and demonstrable by the most sophisticated instruments of modern science. It had been valuable enough to be guarded with utmost secrecy for generations, recorded in code by someone who understood its importance, and preserved to the present day in the form of shields that held within their chemical composition a secret that took centuries to finally be read. The story of the lost metallic alloy is, ultimately, a story about the fragility of human knowledge and the extraordinary persistence of human beings in recovering what was lost. It is a story that reminds us that the past is not a fully known reality, but a vast territory that still holds countless surprises for anyone with the patience and curiosity to seek them out. Objects that seem simple can contain the traces of an intelligence and skill that surprise us when we finally examine them with close attention and adequate instruments. Research into medieval metallurgy did not end with the discoveries described here. There are shields and artifacts still awaiting detailed analysis. There are manuscripts in dozens of libraries waiting to be examined with interdisciplinary care. And there are dedicated researchers who continue, with patience and method, the work of recovering what time took from us. If this historical journey awakened in you the same curiosity that drives the researchers who dedicated their careers to this age-old mystery, then it fulfilled its deepest purpose. History is always around us, hidden in objects that seem mundane, kept in archives awaiting the researcher with the right question, preserved in chemical compositions that silently resisted oblivion for centuries. There are many stories like this waiting to be found and told. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming documentaries, because every new release is a new window into a past that has much more to tell us than we imagine. Like the video if this medieval enigma changed the way you view the seemingly simple objects that have reached us across the centuries. And leave your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe there are other secrets hidden in ancient artifacts that we have not yet learned to read? Your perspective could be the starting point for the next documentary we will explore together.